The day I realized my grandson was trying to sell my wedding ring, my hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from age, but from a cold, creeping sense that something precious had already been stolen long before the ring ever left my finger. I was standing at the kitchen sink when I overheard him on the phone. The late afternoon light slanted through the window, catching dust in the air, making everything look softer than it felt. He didn't know I was there. He thought my hearing was worse than it is. People always think that once your hair turns white, your ears follow suit. He spoke in a low, urgent voice, pacing the living room floor the way his grandfather used to when money was tight. "Yeah," he said, almost whispering. "Solid gold. Old but real diamonds. I can get it. She won't notice right away." My fingers slipped in the soapy water. A plate shattered in the sink, sharp and sudden. He went silent. I held my breath, waiting for him to come check on me, to ask if I was all right, to lie to my face. But he didn't. His footsteps retreated down the hall, and a door closed softly, too softly for innocence. I dried my hands slowly, deliberately, as if moving too fast might make the truth worse. Then I looked down at my left hand. The ring was still there, warm from my skin, heavy, familiar. That ring had been on my finger for 62 years. It survived childbirth, funerals, winters without heat, summers when we could barely afford ice. It survived my husband's temper, his tenderness, his silence, and finally his death. But suddenly it felt fragile, threatened, like a heartbeat you realize you've been taking for granted. I turned it gently, watching the light catch the small diamond set into the band. Most people saw it as modest, maybe even plain. They didn't know what it carried. When my husband gave me that ring, he was trembling, not because he doubted me, but because he knew what it meant. We were young, poor, and standing on borrowed hope. He told me then, in a voice barely louder than the wind, that the ring wasn't just a promise, it was a confession. I didn't understand at the time. I was too in love to question anything. Now, standing alone in that quiet kitchen, I felt that old confession stirring like a bruise that never healed properly. My grandson had always been charming. That's how these things start. I suppose. He smiled easily, hugged me without hesitation, called me Nan, like it was a badge of honor. When his parents struggled, I let him move in. When he lost jobs, I told myself it was just youth finding its way. When money went missing from my purse once or twice, I blamed my own forgetfulness. But the way he said, "She won't notice," that cut deeper than the thought of losing the ring itself. I walked to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping beneath my weight. The house felt different now, quieter but sharper, like it was listening. I opened the small wooden box where I kept my important things: birth certificates, old photographs, letters tied with ribbon so faded it looked like it might crumble if I touched it, and beneath them, wrapped carefully in yellowing cloth, was the paper I hadn't looked at in years. I hadn't meant to keep it forever. I told myself I would destroy it after my husband died. But grief has a way of freezing time. Days pile on top of each other, and before you know it, Secrets feel too old to disturb. The paper was brittle when I unfolded it. My husband's handwriting stared back at me strong, familiar, unmistakable. A letter he'd written the night before our wedding. I remembered that night now with painful clarity. How he paced the room, how he stopped himself from speaking, again and again, how he finally pressed the ring into my hand like he was passing on a burden instead of a gift. The letter explained everything he never said out loud, about a decision he made before we met, about money borrowed that wasn't his to borrow, about a promise he couldn't undo, and about the ring not bought, not earned, but given to him as collateral for a debt tied to a family who never forgot what was owed. The ring wasn't just jewelry, it was proof that something had been buried instead of resolved, proof that our marriage, for all its love, began with a shadow standing just out of sight. And suddenly, the idea of my grandson selling it didn't feel like coincidence anymore. I heard his door open down the hall. His footsteps slowed near my room, hesitated, then moved away again. He was watching me, just as carefully as I was watching him. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the house breathe, listening to memories whisper, listening to the ring knock softly against the headboard every time I shifted my hand. I wondered how he found out. I wondered who he was talking to. I wondered how far the past was willing to reach to collect what it believed was still owed. By morning, I had made a decision. If my grandson thought he could take the ring and walk away with a little money, he was wrong. And if the world thought an old woman couldn't protect what she carried, it had forgotten something very important. Some inheritances aren't meant to be sold. They're meant to be faced. And I was done hiding. By morning, the house smelled of cold tea and unslept hours. My bones ached the way they always do when the weather is about to change, but this pain was sharper, lodged somewhere behind my ribs. I watched my grandson at breakfast from across the table, studying the way he buttered his toast too carefully, how he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. He talked about nothing traffic, a friend who might stop by later, the price of gas, as if ordinary words could cover what I'd heard the night before. I nodded where I was expected to nod. I smiled when he smiled. Old women learn early how to wear their faces like masks. The ring felt heavier than ever on my finger. I kept my hand folded in my lap, thumb rubbing the inside of the band where the engraving had worn smooth over decades. I wondered if he'd already measured it with his eyes, if he'd imagined it off my hand, if he'd practiced the moment in his mind the way thieves do, rehearsing until guilt dulls into practicality. After breakfast, he left the house with his jacket pulled too tight around his shoulders. I listened until his car disappeared down the street. Only then did I allow myself to breathe fully. I locked the door behind him. That simple click echoed through the house like a decision. I went back to my bedroom and opened the wooden box again. The letter lay where I'd left it, as if it had never stopped waiting for me. I read it again, slower this time, letting every word sting fresh. My husband had written it with love and fear tangled together, the way his life always seemed to be. He hadn't lied to me, not exactly. He had simply chosen silence over confession, believing time would bury the truth deeper than any grave. But time doesn't bury things. It preserves them. There was a name in the letter, one I'd tried very hard to forget, a family name tied to that debt, to the ring, to promises made in desperation. I whispered it aloud now, testing how it felt in my mouth after all these years. It tasted bitter. I wondered how my grandson knew. I had never spoken of it. I was careful, always. Even my children knew nothing beyond what they needed to know. But secrets, I've learned, have a way of leaking through cracks you don't see. Old documents misplaced, a name overheard, a question asked in the wrong place. I closed the box and stood, my knees protesting. The mirror caught my reflection as I passed. I barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked smaller somehow, folded in on herself by years of compromise. But her eyes, those were still sharp. Those had not aged the way the rest of me had. I took the ring off for the first time in decades. My finger felt naked, pale where the gold had shielded it from the sun. I wrapped the ring carefully, the same way I'd wrapped it the day my husband died, when I couldn't bear to look at it for a few hours. Then I hid it not where anyone would think to look, not even where I'd kept it before. I chose a place that required patience and memory, two things my grandson had never mastered. When he returned that afternoon, he noticed it immediately. His eyes flicked to my hand before he caught himself. The pause was brief, but I saw it. Of course I did. "Nan," he said lightly, "you okay? You look tired." "I am tired," I replied. And for once, it wasn't a lie. "Sit down. We need to talk." His shoulders stiffened. He sat, but not comfortably. He perched, ready to bolt. I folded my hands together, letting him see the bare finger. I watched the calculation begin behind his eyes. "I heard you on the phone," I said softly. The color drained from his face. For a moment, he looked like a little boy again, caught with his hand in a jar he couldn't explain away. Then the mask slipped back on defensive, practiced. "You misunderstood," he said too quickly. "I was talking about something else." I smiled sadly. "I didn't misunderstand. I understood perfectly. You were talking about my ring." Silence spread between us, thick and uncomfortable. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling up now that denial had failed. "It's just a ring," he said, not unkindly, but dismissive. "You don't even wear it half the time anymore, and I need the money, just for a while. I was going to replace it." "Replace it?" I laughed then, a short, broken sound that surprised both of us. "You can't replace it," I said, "and you can't sell it. Not without consequences you don't understand." He frowned. "What consequences?" "It's mine when you're gone anyway." The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel, but because they were honest in a way that stripped something bare. "That ring doesn't belong to you," I said quietly. "It doesn't even really belong to me." He leaned forward now, curiosity outweighing guilt. "What does that mean?" I stood, slow and deliberate. My joints screamed, but I ignored them. "It means that ring carries a debt that was never paid. And if you try to sell it, you won't just lose money. You'll wake things that have been asleep for a very long time." He laughed. "Uneasy." "Nan, you're being dramatic." "Am I?" I asked, meeting his eyes. Or are you scared because you know I'm not? Something shifted then, a flicker of recognition. He knew more than he'd let on. I saw it in the tightening of his jaw. How did you find out? I asked. He didn't answer. I took a step closer. Who have you been talking to? Still nothing. I nodded slowly. All right. Then listen to me. That ring stays where it is. You will not touch it. You will not mention it. And you will stop whatever arrangement you think you've made. And if I don't? He challenged, a tremor in his voice. Then, I said, feeling the weight of decades settle into my spine, you'll learn what that ring really costs. He stood abruptly, anger flashing. You can't control me. No, I agreed softly, but the past can. That night, I slept with the light on, the house wrapped around me like an old warning. Somewhere, lines were being crossed. Somewhere, the past had already begun to stir. And my grandson, for all his bravado, was standing closer to the edge than he realized. The house didn't settle that night. It creaked and sighed as if every beam remembered something I had tried to forget. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my bare finger curled against my palm, feeling the absence of the ring like a missing tooth, something your tongue keeps searching for long after it's gone. Every sound made my heart jump. A car passing, a branch scraping the window, footsteps that weren't there. I kept thinking about his face when I mentioned the past. Not confusion, not disbelief, recognition. That was when I knew deep down, in that quiet place where denial can't reach, that my grandson already knew more than he should. The next morning, I found my bedroom door slightly open. I am certain I closed it. The wooden box was exactly where I'd left it, but the lid wasn't sitting right. Just a fraction off. Enough to tell me someone had touched it. My breath caught as I crossed the room. I opened the box with shaking hands. The letter was gone. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I just stood there, listening to my own pulse roar in my ears. That letter had survived fires, floods, and grief. I'd protected it for decades, not out of loyalty to my husband, but because it was dangerous in the wrong hands, and now it was in his. I sat down hard on the bed, the mattress sagging beneath me. My first instinct was to confront him, to demand it back, but anger has never been my strongest weapon. Patience is, silence is, and fear, when wielded correctly, can be sharper than any blade. I waited. When he came home that evening, he was different, too calm, too confident. He whistled as he set his keys down, as if he hadn't just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He didn't look at my hands this time. He didn't need to. You move around a lot for someone your age, he said casually, pouring himself a drink. Hard to keep track of where you hide things. I folded my hands together, my nails pressing into my skin. You went through my things, he shrugged. I needed answers. You stole a letter. He finally looked at me then. His eyes were cold, calculating. Not cruel worse than that, curious. You were never supposed to keep it, he said. You were supposed to let it go. I felt something crack inside me at the certainty in his voice. Who told you that? He smiled, small and tight. Someone who's been looking for that ring for a very long time. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the chair to steady myself. So it was true. The family hadn't forgotten. The debt hadn't dissolved with time. It had simply waited for a weaker moment. "You don't know what you're involved in," I said. "I know enough," he replied. "I know that ring isn't just sentimental. I know it was never really yours. And I know it's worth more than you ever told anyone." "It's worth more than money," I whispered. "That's your problem," he snapped. "Not mine." I watched him then, not as my grandson, not as the boy I rocked to sleep, but as a stranger shaped by entitlement and impatience. He thought he was in control. He thought he'd outsmarted an old woman clinging to memories. "You think they'll stop once they get the ring?" I asked quietly. He hesitated. "Just a second." "Enough. They promised they would." I laughed again, bitter this time. "Oh, child, promises tied to debts don't end. They evolve." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "They said if I get it to them, everything goes away. No more pressure. No more letters. No more reminders, letters." So they had already reached out to him. "How long?" I asked. "A few months," he admitted. "They knew about me. About us. About you." "Of course they did," I murmured. "They always knew where to look. They just waited for the right person." He stiffened. "What does that mean?" "It means they didn't come to you by accident," I said. "They came because you were easy." His face flushed. "You don't know that." "I know them," I said simply. "And I know desperation when I see it." Silence stretched between us. Outside, the sky darkened, clouds rolling in heavy and low. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. "You're not getting the ring," I said at last. His jaw clenched. "You can't stop me." I met his gaze. "I already have." His eyes flicked around the room. "Where is it?" "Safe," I replied. "And staying that way. You think hiding it changes anything?" he demanded. "They won't stop. They'll come here." I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion settling into my bones. "Let them." He stared at me as if I'd lost my mind. "You don't understand," he said. "They're not like normal people." "No," I agreed, "they're not. Which is why your grandfather made the choice he did." I rose slowly and walked past him toward the hallway. "You see, that ring was never meant to be sold. It was meant to be returned under very specific conditions." I paused at the door and looked back at him. "And you've already ruined the one chance we had to end this quietly." That night, I packed a small bag. I didn't know how much time I had left before the past came knocking, but I knew one thing for certain. I would not let my grandson pay for a sin he didn't fully understand, even if it meant telling the truth at last, even if it meant breaking what little family we had left. Some endings aren't peaceful, some are earned, and the ring hidden, waiting, was about to demand its price. I left before dawn, when the world is quiet enough to pretend you're the only soul awake. I didn't tell my grandson where I was going. I didn't tell him goodbye. He was asleep on the couch when I stepped over his shoes, his mouth slightly open, the way he used to sleep as a child. For just a moment my heart faltered. I almost turned back, almost believed I could still protect him by staying. But protection isn't always shelter. Sometimes it's distance. The bus station smelled of diesel and burnt coffee. I sat on a hard plastic bench with my small bag at my feet, my coat pulled tight around me. The ring was not with me. That was intentional. Carrying it would have been an invitation. Instead, I carried something heavier: memory, truth, and a destination I hadn't visited in over 40 years. As the bus rumbled onto the highway, I watched my town fade into gray shapes and then into nothing at all. Each mile felt like peeling back a layer of skin I'd grown comfortable wearing. I thought of my husband again, the way his jaw tightened whenever that family name appeared in conversation. The way he insisted we never visit certain places, never ask certain questions. I used to think it was pride. Now I knew it was fear. The town I was heading to sat by the river, old and stubborn, like a scar that refuses to fade. I remembered it in fragments: cobblestone streets, iron railings, houses pressed close together as if whispering secrets to one another. When the bus finally stopped, my legs trembled as I stood. Not just from age, from recognition. Some places remember you even when you try to forget them. I walked slowly, leaning on my cane, past storefronts that had changed names but not bones. And there it was at last, the house. Smaller than I remembered, darker, its windows like unblinking eyes. The paint was peeling. The door was new. But the shape of it was the same. I stood there longer than necessary, gathering courage like breath before a dive. Then I knocked. It took a while before footsteps approached. The door opened just enough for a face to appear older than I expected, but unmistakable. Time had been kinder to him than it had been to my husband, and that alone filled me with a sharp, unreasonable anger. "Yes?" he asked cautiously. "I believe you've been looking for something," I said. His eyes widened. Slowly, deliberately, he opened the door fully. "You," he breathed. "I wondered if you were still alive." "So did I," I replied, and stepped inside. The house smelled of old paper and damp wood. He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing. I had not come for comfort. I had come for an ending. "You contacted my grandson," I said, without preamble. "He did not deny it. The debt didn't die with your husband." "No," I agreed, "but the agreement did." He smiled thinly. "Agreements are flexible things." "Not that one," I said. "You broke it first." His expression hardened. "We waited. We were patient. You waited for weakness," I shot back. "For youth. For greed. You knew exactly what you were doing." He turned away, pouring himself a drink with shaking hands. "The ring belongs to us." "The ring," I said carefully, "was collateral, and the debt it secured was paid in full." He laughed, short and humorless. "By whom?" "By me," I said. Silence fell heavy between us. "You see," I continued, "the part my husband couldn't bring himself to tell you, the part he only told me, was that I made a choice after his death. I sold the land, the one you never knew about. I paid what was owed, plus interest. I did it quietly, legally, and I kept the proof." His face drained of color. "That ring," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest, "was no longer collateral. It became a symbol of closure, something he never believed possible." "You're lying." he whispered. I'm old, I replied, not foolish. I reached into my bag and removed the envelope I'd carried all this way. Copies, receipts, signatures, stamped and dated, evidence that time could not erase. His hands trembled as he flipped through them. You had no right, he said finally, his voice breaking. I had every right, I answered. I paid for it. With money, with silence, with 40 years of looking over my shoulder. He sank into a chair, suddenly smaller, older, defeated. You used my grandson, I said, stepping closer. You threatened him. You lied to him. That ends now. They won't stop, he muttered. The others, they will, I interrupted, because if they don't, every piece of this becomes public. Names, documents, all of it. He looked up at me then, truly seeing me for the first time, not as a widow, not as an old woman, but as someone who had survived. What do you want? He asked. I want you to disappear from our lives, I said, and I want you to understand something very clearly. I leaned in, lowering my voice. That ring is not your past. It is my marriage, and you will never touch it. When I left the house, my legs nearly gave out. I sat on a nearby bench, breathing through the ache in my chest, the weight of what I'd done pressing down on me. Ending something like that doesn't come without cost. I could feel it already, settling into my bones. I returned home 2 days later. My grandson was waiting for me. He looked exhausted, older. The house felt bruised, like it had survived a storm. They called, he said quietly. Then they stopped. I nodded. They won't call again. He swallowed hard. You knew all along. I knew enough, I said. His voice cracked. Why didn't you tell me? I reached out and took his hand. It felt colder than it should have, because some truths are heavy, and I wanted to carry them as long as I could. He looked down, ashamed. I'm sorry. I squeezed his hand once, then let go. Sorry doesn't fix everything, but it's a beginning. That night, I went to the place where I'd hidden the ring. I unwrapped it slowly, reverently, and slipped it back onto my finger. It fit the same, but I didn't. Something had shifted. Something had finally closed. There was still one part left to face, and it would be the hardest of all. I thought once the phone stopped ringing and the house fell back into its old rhythms, the hardest part would be over. I was wrong. Silence can be louder than threats when it carries everything you never said. My grandson avoided me for days after I returned. Not out of anger, out of shame. I recognized it because I'd lived with that same quiet weight for most of my marriage. He slept late, left early, filled the space between us with errands and excuses, and I let him. Healing doesn't happen when you force it to look you in the eye. But the truth I had avoided for 60 years was no longer content to sit quietly in a wooden box. One evening, I found myself in the attic, sorting through things I'd ignored for decades. Dust coated everything, softening edges, muting colors, pretending time had been kind. I opened old trunks filled with clothes I no longer remembered wearing, toys my children had loved fiercely and then forgotten. Near the back, beneath a moth-eaten blanket, I found something I hadn't seen since the week after my husband died, a small metal tin. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were photographs, not many. Just enough to tell a story I had refused to read properly. My husband stood beside men I never introduced him to, his smile stiff, his eyes cautious. In one photo, he wasn't smiling at all. He looked cornered, younger than I remembered, scared. At the bottom of the tin was a folded piece of paper I didn't recognize. It wasn't his handwriting. It was mine. I'd written it the night I sold the land, the night I paid the debt, and decided to lock that chapter of our lives away forever. I'd written myself a promise to never speak of it again, to protect my children from a burden they didn't deserve, to let love be enough to justify the silence. Reading my own words now, I felt the full weight of that decision press down on me. Love had been enough to survive, but it hadn't been enough to heal. That was the truth I needed to face. When I came downstairs, my grandson was sitting at the table, his head in his hands. The ring caught the light as I moved, and he looked up at it, then at me. "I think I understand now," he said quietly. "Do you?" I asked, sitting across from him. "I thought you were hiding something from me," he continued. "I didn't realize you were hiding it from me." I closed my eyes for a moment. Protection can look like betrayal when you don't know the whole story. He nodded. "I became exactly what they were counting on." "Yes," I said gently, "but you stopped before it was too late." He swallowed hard. I read the letter. I felt the old ache bloom again, sharp and familiar, and I realized Grandpa wasn't weak, he said. He was trapped, and you were the one who got him out. I hadn't known how badly I needed to hear that until tears blurred my vision. I reached across the table, and this time, when I took his hand, he didn't pull away. "There's one more thing you should know," I said. He stiffened slightly. "More?" "Yes," I replied, "because endings don't work unless they're honest." I told him about the land, about the nights I lay awake calculating numbers, weighing fear against freedom, about the moment I signed my name and felt both relief and grief crash into me at once. I told him how his grandfather never knew, not because I didn't trust him, but because I wanted him to rest without that shadow hanging over him. When I finished, the room felt lighter somehow, as if the walls themselves had been listening and finally exhaled. "I sold a future to buy peace," I said softly, "and I never regretted it." Not once. My grandson wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, embarrassed but not apologetic. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I didn't earn mine either," I replied. "Yet here we are." That night I slept deeply for the first time in years. No dreams, no footsteps in the dark, just rest. But peace, I learned, is not passive. It asks something of you. A week later, I received a letter, no return address. My heart skipped until I opened it. Inside was a single sentence, written in careful, deliberate ink. "It's finished." I stared at the words for a long time, then folded the paper and placed it in the tin with the photographs and my old promise. Some things deserve to be archived, not carried. The next morning, I took the ring off again, but this time it was different. There was no fear in the gesture. I held it up to the light, turning it slowly, seeing not the weight of debt or danger, but the years it had witnessed. Love, pain, survival. I called my grandson into the room. "I want you to have this," I said. His eyes widened. "No, I can't. You can," I interrupted, "because now you know what it means." "I don't want to own it," he said quietly. "I want to protect it." I smiled. "Then you're ready." We went together to the small box in the closet where I kept the rest of my important papers. I placed the ring inside, not as a hidden secret, but as a shared responsibility. That was the difference. The past no longer had a single keeper. And for the first time since my husband slipped that ring onto my trembling finger, I felt something settle into place. Not closure, freedom. One last part remained, not with them, not with him, but with myself. I thought facing myself would be easier than facing everyone else. After all, I had lived with myself longer than anyone. I knew my habits, my excuses, the little lies I told to get through hard days. But when the house finally grew quiet again, when my grandson moved through it without flinching, when the phone stayed silent, when the ring rested peacefully in its place, I realized how wrong I had been. The hardest reckoning is the one that doesn't come with raised voices or threats. It comes in stillness. I began to notice how tired I was, not the ordinary tiredness of age, but the kind that settles into your spirit after decades of carrying something alone. I would sit by the window in the afternoons, watching the light change, and feel the years press in around me like a long exhale I'd been holding since my wedding day. I started talking to my husband then, not out loud, people might think me mad, but quietly, in the way widows do when the world no longer offers answers. I should have told you, I would think. I should have trusted you with the truth. But another voice, my own, younger and steadier, would answer back. You did what you had to do. That argument played on repeat until one morning I woke with a clarity that startled me. Regret and responsibility are not the same thing. I had mistaken one for the other all my life. I didn't regret saving us. I regretted believing I had to disappear inside the act of saving. So I did something small, but monumental for me. I told the rest of the family. I gathered my children first, sitting them down at the same table where their son had once planned to sell my ring. Their faces were lined now, shaped by worries of their own. I told them the truth, not every detail, not every fear, but enough. About the debt, about the ring, about the choice I made when their father died. They were quiet for a long time. Then my daughter reached across the table and took my hand. "You carried this alone?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I thought that was my job." She shook her head gently. "Your job was to love us. You did that." My son wiped his eyes, embarrassed, just like his boy had been. "We would have helped," he said softly. "I know," I replied. "That's why I didn't ask." We cried together then, not dramatic sobs, just the steady release of something long held. I felt lighter when they left, like I'd finally set down a bag I forgot I was carrying. That evening, my grandson sat with me on the porch. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in colors I didn't have names for anymore. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what kind of man I want to be." I smiled faintly. "That's a good thing to think about. I don't want shortcuts," he continued. I don't want other people's mistakes to become my excuses. I nodded. Then learn from them, don't repeat them. He hesitated. Do you forgive me? I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not betrayal, not greed, but fear. Fear of failing, fear of being small, fear of being forgotten. I forgave you the moment you chose to stop, I said. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's deciding what doesn't get to own you. He leaned his head against my shoulder, careful, like he was afraid I might disappear if he leaned too hard. Weeks passed. Life softened again. Not perfect, never that, but honest. The ring stayed where it was, no longer hidden out of fear, but kept with intention. Sometimes I would take it out and tell its story to myself one last time, then wrap it back up, content. One afternoon, as I sorted through old papers, I found our wedding photo. My husband stood beside me, young and unsure, the ring gleaming on my hand like a quiet vow. I studied his face and realized something that made me laugh softly through my tears. He had trusted me all along. He trusted me to survive what he couldn't face. That understanding didn't erase the years of silence, but it reframed them. Love isn't always confession. Sometimes it's faith. When my time comes, and I feel it edging closer now, gentle but insistent, I know how this story will be told. Not as a tale of greed or betrayal, but as one of inheritance properly understood. The ring will go to my grandson one day, not as something to sell, not as leverage, not as proof of anything dark, but as a reminder that love can be complicated and still be real. That protection can look like silence, but healing requires voice. That the past only has power when you refuse to meet it. My grandson once tried to sell my wedding ring, but what he really tried to sell was a story he didn't yet understand. Now he knows, and so do I. The ring was never just jewelry. It was a lesson, and at last it has been learned. The weeks after that passed more gently than I expected, like the world had finally decided to stop testing me. Morning light returned to the kitchen the way it used to, soft and forgiving. The house no longer felt like it was holding its breath, and yet I knew this calm was not an ending, it was a settling. The quiet after a long confession. I felt my body changing, not in a frightening way, just in a way that made me aware of time. I moved slower. I rested more. Some afternoons I sat in my chair and watched the dust dance in the sunlight, thinking about how many moments I'd rushed through when I was younger, convinced life would wait for me to be ready. It never does. One evening I asked my grandson to bring the small box out. He did so carefully, as if it contained something fragile, which, in a way, it did. We sat at the table together. I opened it, and there it was. The ring, quiet, unassuming, patient. I want to tell you the part I never told anyone, I said. He looked at me, attentive now in a way he hadn't been before all of this. Experience has a way of sharpening listening. The night your grandfather gave me this ring, I continued, he asked me something. He asked if I trusted him enough to marry him even if the future didn't look the way we planned. My grandson swallowed. And you said yes. Yes, I smiled. Without hesitation. That was the truest thing I ever did. I lifted the ring, letting it rest in my palm. What I didn't know then was that I would spend most of my life being the strong one, and I don't say that with resentment. Strength is not a punishment, but it is lonely when you believe you have to carry it alone. He reached across the table, placing his hand over mine. No words, none were needed. I don't want you to be afraid of the past, I told him. But I also don't want you to romanticize it. Learn from it. Let it make you kinder, more patient, less eager to trade meaning for convenience. He nodded slowly. I promise. I believed him. That night, after he went to bed, I did something I had never done before. I took out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote a letter, not to the past, not to my husband, but to myself. I wrote about the woman I had been, the girl who believed love could fix everything, the wife who learned that love sometimes asks you to become more than you imagined, the grandmother who almost lost something precious, not because of age, but because silence had stretched on too long. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it beside the ring. Two keepers of the same truth. My health declined quietly after that. No drama, no hospital alarms, just the gentle narrowing of my days. I felt it coming the way you feel winter in your bones before the first cold snap. I prepared the way women of my generation always do, by putting things in order. I organized documents. I labeled boxes. I made lists no one asked for, but everyone would one day appreciate. And finally, I called my grandson into my room. I want you to listen carefully, I said. Not because I'm leaving just yet, but because when the moment comes, you shouldn't be surprised. His eyes filled, but he stayed quiet. That ring, I said, will be yours, but not as an object, as a responsibility. If you ever feel tempted to sell it, trade it, or hide behind it, remember this story. Remember what it cost. Remember what it saved. He nodded, tears slipping free now. I will. Good, I said. Then I can rest. On my last good morning, the sunlight found its way to my face the way it always had. I lay there listening to the house, my house filled with the quiet sounds of life continuing. Somewhere, my grandson was making coffee. Somewhere, the future was unfolding without fear. I thought of my husband then, not as the man with secrets, but as the man who loved me enough to trust me with them, even if he never found the courage to speak them aloud. I thought of the ring, how it began as a symbol of promise, how it became a burden, how it nearly became a betrayal, and how, in the end, it became what it was always meant to be, a truth passed forward instead of hidden away. My grandson once tried to sell my wedding ring, but in doing so, he gave me something I didn't know I still needed, an ending, not neat, not painless, but honest. And that, I have learned, is the rarest inheritance of all. I didn't die that morning. That's something people always expect at the end of a story like this. They imagine a soft fade, a last breath taken in sunlight, the ring resting quietly somewhere safe. But life rarely listens to the shape of stories. It keeps going, stubborn and unfinished, even when you feel ready to stop speaking. I woke the next day with a headache and a strange sense of relief, like I'd set something heavy down and forgotten what my hands were supposed to hold next. My grandson hovered, anxious, offering water, offering apologies I no longer needed. I waved him off with a smile. "I'm still here," I told him. "Don't rush me." He laughed through his tears, and something between us finally settled into its proper shape. Not parent and child, not savior and sinner, but two people bound by a truth neither of us was running from anymore. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. My strength came and went like the tide. Some mornings I felt almost young, moving through the house with purpose, humming old songs while dusting shelves. Other days, my bones refused cooperation, and I stayed in bed, listening to the world move without me. And that was all right. The ring stayed in its place. We didn't talk about it much anymore. It no longer demanded attention. Its power had faded now that it had been understood. Secrets thrive in darkness. Once spoken, they lose their teeth. One afternoon, my grandson brought me an envelope. "It came today," he said. "No return address." I felt my chest tighten for just a moment before calm returned. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single photograph. The house by the river empty, boarded up, a notice nailed crookedly to the door. Condemned, sold, forgotten. On the back, 2 words were written in the same careful ink as before. "We're done." I handed the photo back to him. "That's the last of it." He exhaled, long and shaky. "I hate what I almost became." "So do I," said gently. "That's how you know you didn't become it. That night I dreamed of my husband for the first time in years. He stood the way he had on our wedding day, nervous, hopeful, holding out the ring with hands that didn't quite know how to be steady yet. But this time, when I took it, he smiled without fear. No shadows behind his eyes, no words left unsaid. When I woke, my pillow was damp with tears, but my heart felt light. I began giving things away after that, not because I was leaving, but because I finally understood the difference between holding and hoarding. I gave my granddaughter my pearls. I gave my daughter the recipe cards stained with butter and thyme. I gave my grandson the stories he asked for and some he didn't know to ask. And one quiet afternoon, I asked him to bring me the box. He sat beside my bed as I opened it. The ring lay there, familiar and calm. I lifted it one last time and slid it onto my finger. "I won't wear it much longer," I said, "but I wanted to feel it again, just once." He watched silently. "I loved your grandfather," I continued, "not because he was perfect, but because he trusted me with his broken parts. Love isn't the absence of secrets. It's what you do when the secrets finally surface." I took the ring off and pressed it into his palm. "Now it's yours," I said, "not when I'm gone. Now." He tried to protest. I stopped him with a look. "You don't inherit things when someone dies," I told him. "You inherit them when you're ready." He closed his fingers around it, reverent, changed. Years from now, people may talk about that ring. They may say it was valuable, antique, worth a small fortune. They will be wrong. Its value was never in the gold or the stone. It was in the choices it forced, the truths it demanded, the courage it revealed too late, and then, at last, just in time. My grandson once tried to sell my wedding ring, but what he really tried to sell was silence, and what he bought instead was truth. When my time does come and I feel it waiting patiently, like an old friend, I know how this story will end, not with regret, not with bitterness, but with something far rarer, understanding. The ring will remain, the lesson will remain, and love complicated, imperfect, fiercely human will remain. That is what I leave behind, not jewelry, a legacy. I used to think legacies were loud things, houses passed down, names etched into stone, rings handed over with speeches and tears. But as the days continued ordinary, quiet, stubbornly alive, I learned that legacies are often invisible while they're being made. After I gave him the ring, my grandson didn't wear it. That mattered to me. He kept it in the box, tucked into the back of his drawer, wrapped carefully, the way you treat something living that needs rest. Sometimes I would catch him opening that drawer and just standing there, not touching it, only looking, thinking. I never asked what passed through his mind in those moments. Some questions don't need answers to do their work. I stayed longer than anyone expected, even me. Age is strange like that. It threatens, then retreats. It teaches you not to bargain with it, only to listen. My body slowed, but my mind felt clearer than it had in years, without the weight of the secret pressing against my chest. I found space for small joys I'd once rushed past warm bread, the sound of rain hitting the roof at night, the comfort of being known. One afternoon, I found my grandson at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of him. Bills, budgets, applications. Honest work. He looked up at me, a little sheepish. "I'm trying to do things right," he said. "I know," I replied. "I can see it in how you move now." He paused. "I still think about that phone call, about who I was in that moment." "So do I," said, "but not with anger." "Then how?" he asked. "With gratitude," I answered, "because it showed us where the cracks were before the house collapsed." He nodded, absorbing that in the quiet way he'd learned since everything came into the open. Months later, he brought someone home, a woman with kind eyes and cautious manners, the sort who watches before she speaks. I liked her immediately, not because she was polite, many people are polite, but because she listened when I talked, really listened, as if my words mattered even when they wandered. One evening, when she thought I couldn't hear, she asked him about the ring. He didn't tell her everything. He told her enough. "That's not something you sell," he said simply. "That's something you earn the right to keep." I smiled to myself in the dark. The seasons turned. My hands grew thinner, my steps shorter, but my heart felt steady in a way it never had before. When you stop guarding a secret, you realize how much energy it took just to stand upright under its weight. On my birthday, my grandson placed a small box in front of me. "Open it," he said. Inside was not the ring. It was something else entirely. A simple chain, plain, unassuming. Hanging from it was a tiny charm, no stone, no engraving, just smooth metal shaped by careful hands. "What is it?" I asked. "It's not worth anything," he said quickly. "Not like the ring." I laughed. "Then it's perfect." I wanted you to have something that didn't come with a past, he continued. Something that didn't owe anyone anything. I closed my fingers around it, feeling warmth spread through my palm. Thank you, I said, and meant more than the words could hold. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how strange it was that a ring something meant to symbolize permanence had only found peace once it stopped being worn. Once it stopped pretending to be simple. I thought about my husband again, about the man he was before fear shaped him, about the man he tried to be despite it. I no longer felt the urge to forgive him. Forgiveness implies a debt. I understood him, and understanding, I learned, is far gentler. When the end finally came, and yes, it did, as it always does, it did not announce itself with drama. It came the way evening comes, gradual, certain. I felt tired, but not afraid. My grandson sat with me, holding my hand, his thumb tracing the lines time had carved there. I'm here, he said, as if I might doubt it. I know, I whispered. In those final moments, I didn't think about the ring. I didn't think about the debt or the threats or the fear. I thought about the choice I made all those years ago to stay, to protect, to love, even when it meant carrying more than my share, and I felt at peace with it. After I was gone, they told me he opened the box one last time. They told me he held the ring, not with longing, not with temptation, but with respect. They told me he didn't put it on, he placed it back. Because by then, he understood. The ring was never meant to decorate a hand. It was meant to shape a life. My grandson once tried to sell my wedding ring, but in the end, it was the ring that changed him. And if that is the final chapter of my story, then I am content, because nothing of value was lost.